So I wanted to share a story with you today about my own struggle with being anxious and being depressed. In fact, I think it goes back for most of my life. At about the age of 10, my dad sat my brother and I down one day. I remember the day really vividly, like it just happened. And we were sitting in our backyard. My brother, who's younger than me and my dad, my mom was in the kitchen with her friend. My dad sat down to tell us that my mom had about 1 month to live with the breast cancer diagnosis that she had. In fact, that wasn't a new story for us. Several times over the course of the last years, my dad had to sit my brother and I down and say, things are really bad, and the doctors have given your mom a very short period of time to live. But then she would live again, and things would get better. And then the news would come that things weren't so good, and then she would get better. But this time was different. And I remember going outside after that and sitting with my brother and saying, I don't think God's gonna let her die. There's just no way God's gonna let her die. And she didn't for that one more entire year, in fact. And then near the end of that last year, she went into a coma and died in 1986, April 20th, 1986. I was 11 years old, my brother was about 8.5. And for me, I remember that being distinctly as the moment that anxiety really took root in my life. And in hindsight, I see that's where I became more and more down and depressed. This period in my life, this really crucial period of just going back and forth and all the unknowns and all of the fear and all of the struggles. And I remember going to school 2 weeks later for the first time after she died. I remember sitting in class, and I don't remember the exact day it was or the exact moment, but I remember the teacher calling me to read for the first time since I'd been back at school. And I was the kid who used to love to read all the time. I was always raising my hand. Teacher called me to read, and this time I couldn't literally produce the sound. Like I could see the words in the page, and I knew what they said, but I could not produce a sound. In fact, if you were sitting next to me, you might have heard something like a like this stuttering noise. And it was in that moment that I began to live more and more in fear, to be anxious about every day. In fact, I'll tell you that my grade school, my middle school, my high school, every day was filled with fear. What if the teacher's gonna call on me to read? And so I started to avoid situations where I'd be put in a place where I might become anxious. Or every Sunday night, knowing that I had to go back to school the next day, I would have this sense of like being just down and depressed, just feeling alone. And so for me, this journey through anxiety and depression started really, really early. And it happened most of my life. And I remember being in high school thinking, I can't wait to go to college because I'd heard stories that you didn't have to read out loud in college or that you didn't have to go to class. So I couldn't wait to go to college. But things didn't change in college very much. I was fearful of picking up the phone and calling somebody. And I started to kind of shrink in as a person and avoid situations. And I thought I was really alone. No one talked about it. No one talked about being anxious. No one else talked about being depressed. And I remember one night, I was a junior, and I'd kind of had enough, and I decided to say this prayer to God. It's one of those prayers that when you utter it, you just kind of hope maybe he doesn't answer it. But I remember saying to God, okay, God, if you give me an opportunity to speak, I will take it. I'll do it. I'll force myself to speak. Like, help me, put me out there. So essentially it was a prayer like, God, put me in my worst situation because I feel like something will happen there. Like somehow I have to face my anxiety if I'm gonna grow as a person or be transformed in some way. And I said that prayer as a junior, and I went to bed, and I remember 2 weeks later, I got a phone call from the chapel office at my small school, my small college, and they said, Rhett, we'd love for you to come to the Easter morning sunrise service there in April at our school. And I thought, no way. There is no way I'm getting up and doing the Easter morning sunrise service. And so I said no, and I hung up the phone, and I sat down. I remember thinking, this is exactly what I asked for. This is what I had prayed for. And so I picked the phone back up, and I called my friend, and I said, okay, I'll do it. I'll take this opportunity. And man, I would love to tell you that the next couple of months in preparation were great and that things went well, but they didn't. And I'd love to tell you that I got up that morning in, what year was it, 1996, and tell you that, man, that was the best sermon ever delivered, but it wasn't. I literally stuttered my way all the way through it. But I preached on the resurrection of Christ and resurrected faith and talked about my mom's own journey. And somehow in that moment, I realized that something was changing for me. It was the first time in my life that I really began to face my anxiety It's the first time in my life I really began to face these blues and this downness and this depression that I was experiencing. And something began to change in me. And I began to realize that I wasn't alone, that this was a struggle that many people had. And I didn't realize it till later. In fact, most of my 20s were marked with kind of avoiding anxiety and avoiding trying to be down and be depressed. And I finally decided to get help around the age of 30. And I remember spending almost every week in counseling for about 3 years working through my depression and working through my anxiety. And I started to realize I wasn't alone. In fact, many of you out there might feel like you're alone. You might feel like the anxiety and the depression you're experiencing is something that only you have. And you're right to kind of think that because no one talks about it often, so it does feel like it's alone. But I want you to know that you're not alone. In fact, if you look at the statistics today, 18% of our population, so about roughly 40 million people ages 18 over, are diagnosed with an anxiety disorder every year. So looking out this room, if there were just 100 of you, that'd mean at least almost 20 of you would be diagnosed with anxiety disorder. And I have to think the other 80 of you struggle with anxiety or depression throughout different seasons in your life. So it is a huge issue. And we also know that half the people who are diagnosed with depression are also at the same time diagnosed with anxiety. It seems like they almost go hand in hand, like they did in my own story, in my own situation. You might feel that way in your own life right now. And however you describe it, here's what I often hear from people. I hear people talk about the anxiety of being this kind of feeling on edge, or feeling like they're irritable, or feeling a sense of dread or fear that they talk about. I often hear them describing kind of like a pain in their stomach, like just kind of sick to their stomach, or a mind that just won't turn off. Or when someone comes in and talk about feeling depressed, I hear things like, I feel down, or I feel like I have the blues, or I feel discouraged, or I feel hopeless. If you resonate with any of those things, know that you are not alone. I would say a lot of people in this room, a lot of people out there struggle with anxiety and struggle with depression. And as I began to do my own work, and as I began to move into my own therapy and eventually become a therapist, I started to ask more questions of God. Where is God in the midst of this journey for us? Where is God in the midst of my anxiety? Where is God in the midst of my depression? And you may have that same question yourself. Where is God in the midst of this story? And so I started to ask questions, and the people I work with started to ask questions. In fact, time and time again, I'd have someone sitting across from me who would say, I'm anxious and I'm depressed and I don't know who to talk to. I tried going to my church, I tried talking to my pastor, I tried talking to my friend, and I get the same answer. They tell me, something's wrong with your faith, or you just have to pray harder and it'll go away. Or I'd hear often someone would quote Philippians 4:6, where Paul says, don't be anxious. But Rhett, guess what? I read that passage and I prayed harder and I'm still anxious, and so here I am. What do we do about this? And so I had these questions, and you might have those questions. And as I began to look at the text, I started to think, God is really in the midst of this. It's not that God, I thought, was giving me my anxiety and giving my depression, but I started to think that, no, God was actually in the midst of my anxiety and depression. God was the one who was helping me transform that stuff and helping me see my anxiety and depression not as an enemy that's trying to crush me, but really as an opportunity for growth in my own life. And I remember telling somebody one day in session about that story about Paul. I'm like, Paul, by the time he pens those words in Philippians 4:6, literally he's at the end of his life and he's writing those very words from prison, right? And he's saying, here's what you do with this anxiety. You turn it towards God. You put it towards prayer and petition to God. And this is the same Paul who only 2 chapters earlier in Philippians 2, he talks about his anxiety for his friend who is sick. So in this same small, book here, the same small passage, we have the same guy saying, man, I'm anxious for my friend. I have anxiety. And then over here, don't be anxious. And I started to realize anxiety, like depression, is just a complicated thing. And I started to think, where is God in the midst of this situation? And I began to look at that word even in the New Testament for anxiety. And it literally means, hey, sometimes don't be anxious. And you know what? Sometimes Be anxious. It shows a sign of care. It shows concern. I often describe this to people I work with as this way. If my wife and I are in a conflict, for example, and I'm anxious about that, that's a good thing. That pit in my stomach, that anxiety tells me I have concern for her. I have care for her. I have concern for our relationship. In fact, I don't want that anxiety to go away. It tells me something is wrong, that things will not be right until her and I restore that relationship. So in some ways, that anxiety feeling propels me to seek change in my life. I also think about David. There's many examples in the Psalms. There's one recently that's been in my head, and that's Psalm 38. And there's a couple of verses, specifically verse 6, where David talks about all day long he is just down on the ground, and he is in grief, and he is in mourning, and his body aches. That's a sign of someone who is depressed. So whether it's Paul writing in Philippians or it's David in Psalms, I think you and I come from a long, rich history of people who've experienced suffering, who've experienced anxiety, who've experienced what it feels like to be depressed. Or I think just about the grand story of the Exodus, God leading his people out of the wilderness on this journey that literally should have taken only 13 days, but somehow turns into 40 years. And though the text doesn't always say the words anxious or depressed, you see stories of people who are anxious. They're wondering if God's going to provide for them or protect them or give food. You see people who are struck down and who are suffering with the loss of the life they had, or people who are dying. The Exodus story is full of anxiety and is full of depression. And so again, I think you and I are not alone, but you may find yourself in this wilderness place. And so there are a few things as I think about anxiety and depression that I really want to encourage you to do and to think about. And it's great that there is a community of people here that you can come alongside of and can help you dive deeper. But 3 things that I always talk to everybody with and that have also been helpful in my own life. And number 1 is just managing day-to-day anxiety and depression can be really tough. Sometimes it's just hard to get out of bed. Sometimes it's hard to get meals ready. Sometimes it's hard just to get the energy to go to work. Sometimes it's hard to turn off all the negative thoughts and emotions that are in your head. And so number 1, I want to just ask you a question is, what are you doing right now just to take care of the basic needs in your life? Just to kind of get by. And so I always talk to people I work with, how are you taking care of your physical life, your emotional life, your mental life, and your spiritual life? So physically, what are you doing to exercise or to eat healthy or to get sleep? Those basic things have huge impact in terms of affecting our depression and affecting our anxiety. And I talk about our emotional self-care. Are there things that you are doing to connect to your emotional life, your inner life? Are there relationships that you're fostering? Are you doing a date night with your spouse? Are you getting out over coffee with your friends? Are you getting some alone time and downtime? And often people who are anxious and depressed often find themselves isolating and not taking care of those things. Or I talk about your mental life. How do you mentally take care of yourself? What are those things that stimulate your intellect and help you grow? Are there books you're reading or podcasts you're listening to or sermons you're watching? And then last, spiritual self-care. What are you doing to spiritually care for yourself, to connect to God? That could be prayer. That could be belonging to a church community. That could be just listening. Sometimes in my experience, when we're suffering with anxiety and depression, God seems so far away, and it's really hard to know how to connect. And in situations like that, sometimes I just recommend to a person to sit down and just to meditate on that psalm that I love, Psalm 46:10. Be still and know that I'm God. And just be still and just listen and just connect. So self-care is huge. And so I would encourage you to think about, is there one thing in each of those areas or just one thing overall that you could begin to maybe practice and take care of this week and to build a habit around? Because I think that's essential as we begin on this journey of anxiety and depression. There's another thing that I think is so basic that I think people overlook, and that is just being able to pause and take a deep breath. I don't know about you, but if you've been around or you've had this experience yourself where you are anxious and you almost have a panic attack, or you're depressed and you're down, literally what happens to people is they stop breathing. Literally, we stop breathing and our chest gets really shallow and things fall apart. And so one of the best things, one of the most practical things I've done for people is just to help pause and say, let's just take a breath here. Let's just take a breath. And I can't even get into all the ways that affects the brain physiologically, but it's powerful. And so there are some basic things that I think you could walk out of this room and begin to think about changing and trying and experimenting with. The second thing I want to encourage you to maybe explore and look at is to reach out for help. That could be through a professional counselor, that could be through a pastor, that could be through a friend, that could be going to see a doctor. I know there is this huge stigma, not only in our culture at large, but also in the church community, that somehow if I reach out for help and let people know that I'm struggling, that I might be judged or I might be looked down upon. But I want to encourage you to step outside of that and to reach out, to look for a safe group of people, a safe person, because they're out there, and I know they're out there, and to say, hey, I need help. I don't know what to do next. So I think all of us need to look for a guide that we can begin to dive deep, right? It's one thing just to kind of manage your anxiety and depression, but second, we have to look at the roots of it. What is causing it? I didn't know this till later in my life when I started to go back in my own counseling, but I began to realize that anxiety and depression wasn't really a primary feeling. It was a behavior. It was a coping behavior. I became anxious and I became depressed because some feeling got triggered. And for me, what I began to learn over my own journey is that anytime I felt alone or I felt abandoned or I felt like I just didn't measure up, man, I became anxious and I became depressed. And I started to realize in my own work, a lot of that went back to my early years and that experience, those 5 years of my mom being in and out of the hospital. And it wasn't until I went back and I did the work and I looked at family issues and I looked at life experiences and I looked at relationships that I began to understand myself better. And when I began to understand myself better, I began to have more grace for myself. And I began to take more responsibility and ownership of the things that I could change and let go of the things that I couldn't change. And so I would encourage you to reach out and to find help and to begin the journey to dive deeper. Because I think you'll find yourself understanding yourself better. I think you'll find yourself, again, lending grace to yourself more. And I think you'll find yourself figuring out what things you can make change in and what things you can't. And then the last thing I want to really encourage you in, which may seem like a crazy idea right now where you're sitting. If you are in the midst right now of struggling with anxiety or depression, no matter how severe or how mild, this may be an impossible idea to think about at the moment, but I want you to think about it. And that is, what if the anxiety and depression that you're experiencing, rather than seeing it as an enemy that is here to like literally just crush you and push you to the ground, what if you saw it as a friend, as a help that wants to help you grow, that maybe it's an opportunity for change in your life? I was thinking about this imagery, and when I was driving over here, I was looking at my car, and I, like all of you who drive, there's a dashboard in your car. And that dashboard has certain lights, and those lights tell you things about the car. They tell me if I need more oil, they tell me if my tires are inflated, they tell me if I need gas, they tell me if something's wrong with the engine. And if I pay attention to those lights, then my car runs smoothly and I don't end up on the side of the road. But there have been times when the lights have come on and I've ignored them. And I've ended up without gas, and I've ended up having to get the car towed into the garage. And what I've come to learn in my experience, both personally and working with people, is that depression and anxiety are often those lights that kind of go off in the dashboard of our life, and they say, hey, something's going on inside of you. Pay attention to it. Pay attention to it. And if you could begin to see your anxiety and depression really as signals, as these lights going off that could possibly inform you of how to make change in your life, I think it's a much healthier way to look at depression and anxiety than as this enemy that's trying to crush you. But I know where you're sitting, that might be a hard thing to think about. So I want to encourage you to really to begin to take that shift in your mind and your heart, and to think about whatever anxiety you have right now going on or depression going on. I want you to begin to think about those things and go, man, what is that saying about where I'm at right now? What is that pointing to? Is it saying there needs to be change in my life? Is there something wrong in my relationships right now? Is there a conversation I need to have? Is there some change I need to make at work? What if anxiety and depression could lead us into growth, into change? And I think I've come to that view through several ways. One is my own personal experience. It wasn't until I decided to talk and God gave me the opportunity in college that I realized it was actually facing my anxiety and my depression that transformed me. And I've had to make that decision all along the way. Even so much one time entering and becoming a pastor, a college pastor for 8 years, and having to get up and preach every Wednesday was my biggest fear. But somehow God grew me through that. And I see it with the people that I work with. When they face their fears and they acknowledge their anxiety and their depression, I often see huge growth happening in their lives. And I see a God in the story, in the biblical story, who constantly has people facing their fears, walking through their anxieties and meeting them in their depressions. And it's in those moments that their life has changed. It's literally in those moments that their name is sometimes changed. But there's always this encounter where you have to face those things. And so I want to close with a story. It's by one of my favorite authors. His name is Parker Palmer. He's got a really great book called Let Your Life Speak. And Parker talks about his seasons of depression during his life that were really severe. They hit him at different periods of his life. And sometimes they lasted weeks and sometimes they lasted months. It was so bad that at different periods of his life, he talks about not being able to get out of bed. Like literally get out of bed, his body was so achy and he couldn't function. And he is this really well-educated, successful professor and writer, and he just couldn't function. And he talked about during that season that one friend came over every single day to his house and sat him up in his chair and pulled off if he had shoes and socks on and just slowly began to massage his feet every day for months. His friend didn't say a word. His friend didn't try to encourage him. His friend didn't try to give him a Bible verse, didn't try to pray for him, just was present with him. And Parker talks about that presence, just the person being with you, as a huge life-changing thing in his life that really helped his depression. And I think about everyone sitting in this room, that there are people around you who want to be present with you, or there are people that you know who are struggling with anxiety and depression, and maybe the best thing you can do is be present with them. And Parker closes that section by saying this, that one day he went to his therapist who he'd been working with during this season, and his therapist said, Parker, I know you've seen depression as this enemy way up here who is just crushing you and trying to destroy your life and pushing you to the ground and just burying you into the ground. He said, what if you could begin to see depression instead as a hand of a friend who's slowly pushing you to the ground gently where it's safe to stand, where it's safe to be on land and it's grounded. And Parker says, that idea at the time was too crazy of an idea to believe, but it changed his relationship with depression and it changed his life with anxiety. And so I leave you with that. In all the midst of struggles and anxieties and depressions that some of you may be facing, I want to really encourage you to begin to think about your relationship with anxiety and depression, and how can you begin to not only reach out for help, but begin to see it in a new light and possibly see it as a way that God is trying to speak to you and work with you and be present with you and change your life and help you grow. Heavenly Father, we just come before you. Thank you for this group of people, and we know, Lord, that you are here in the midst of our sufferings, Lord, that you are present in our anxieties, that you are with us when we feel down and depressed. And those times when we can't really sense your presence, when it feels like our minds are out of control and it feels like we can't get out of bed, I pray that you would just make yourself known. And I pray that you'll bring people into our lives who could walk alongside us during this season, and pray that you will open doors for people to get the help that they need. Make those paths clear. I also pray that you would give us eyes to see people around us who are hurting, that may struggle with anxiety, whether it just be what we might consider some very minor stuff or severe stuff. Those people who are struggling with depression, whether it be a depression for a couple of days or a depression for a couple of months. I pray that you'd give us the eyes to walk alongside those people and to be the person who can be present with them and who can encourage them. And most of all, I just pray that you would help us see, Lord, that your story, the story in the Bible, all the beautiful characters and examples that you give us are people who have been through hard times and seen their fair share of anxieties and depressions. But they come to some place like Paul in Philippians 4:6, ultimately, where in our anxieties, we're able to turn those towards you and to find peace and joy in the midst of it. Amen.